questions, you can ask me in Spanish. I'll try to speak slowly and clearly. Okay, so this is a talk about Darwin's theory of evolution. So you might know a little bit about the history of Darwin, but he essentially began with a sail around the world on this boat, which is called the Her Majesty's Service Beagle, which we see here in the photo of the boat. So he started out from Plymouth, England in 1831, and then went to Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and the Galapagos Islands, and then across the Pacific Ocean, all the way to Australia, and then up around Indonesia, and then South Africa, and then back to Brazil, and then back to England. And that round trip took them about 4 hours, but 4 years, sorry, but they were stopping on different ports. And during that time, he was collecting different species. So the data that he collected, it wasn't put to the book. The book was published in 1859. So that was about 28 years after the data was collected from the trip. So it took him that long time to publish the book, thinking about it and reflecting on the data that he had found. So basically, the theory of Darwin is that organisms reproduce faithfully, basically faithfully, but also with some mutation. And there is something in nature which is called natural selection, because of the limit of resources, whether they be abiotic or biotic, coming from the environment, and because there's competition, so there's a limited amount of resources, that gives rise to competition, and that gives rise then to selection. Those who are better apt at obtaining those resources are those which are going to survive and going to propagate. And there's also something else which he mentioned, which is called sexual selection. That is the attractiveness of the individual to the opposite sex, to be able to reproduce yourself. So we can also talk about a fourth component, which is adaptation. That is, individuals become ever more adapted to their environment. And indeed, they even conquer new environments. So that is basically Darwin's theory. And it makes sense, especially on the organismal level. But there are some problems, and that's what we're going to try to treat today, is the problems with Darwinian theory. And if a theory based on thermodynamics, a little bit more fundamental, and based on physics and chemistry, can try to resolve some of those problems with normal Darwinian theory. And Darwin himself admitted that there were problems with the theory, and we'll go through them. So an interesting article was written by Theodosius Dobzhansky in the 1970s, in 1973, I think. This article I sent to you, so you could find it in your email just before the class began. You should read it. It's a very interesting article. And he wrote it in response to an upsurge in creationism. That is an upsurge in the religious thinking of, in the US, he's an American scientist. In the US, a lot of, in the 1970s, there was a lot of this popular support for religious creationism and the idea that Darwin's theory should not be taught in the schools. And in fact, some of the schools in the more conservative states of the US actually canceled the Darwinian theory. So the teachers were not allowed to teach that theory, and instead they brought in creationism, where we know the theory of God is that God made Adam and Eve and the other animals from clay, and he breathed life into them. But obviously that is not a scientific theory. But at that time, even in the schools, in the popular schools, public schools, the theory of Darwin was being frowned upon. So he wrote this article, which is an interesting article. And the title of the article is "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." I'll just repeat that in Spanish. Nada en biología hace sentido excepto en la luz de la evolución. Now, we have to also admit that biologists are just as serious at defending Darwinian theory as creationists are in defending the theory of God. And it's almost, for example, impossible to publish anything which questions or criticizes Darwinian theory. It's hard to find referees who will allow your paper to be published if you're criticizing the Darwinian theory. So it's become almost like a religion also among the biologists. Not all of them, of course, but the traditional biologists look at it as a well-founded and established theory, and nobody should be questioning it. However, we know that all theories are eventually supplanted by better theories. For example, Newton dynamics, or the laws of Newton, were eventually replaced with Einstein's general theory of relativity, which did much better in predicting some of the interactions between material bodies. And we know also now that Einstein's general theory of relativity is not the ultimate, that there is probably another research program, which some have called pseudo-complex general relativity, which takes into account that there is a minimum length scale. That means that position in nature is discrete, and you can only go down to a minimum length scale, and then the system becomes quantic. And Einstein's theory of relativity is not quantum, it's not quantic. And we also know we have other mysterious things like the dark energy. And so all of this may lead to a new theory, which we could call quantum gravity. And a lot of people are working on that. So even Einstein's theory is not the ultimate theory. So we should have no reason to assume that Darwin's theory is the ultimate theory, that there can be more fundamental theories below that, and particularly theories which are based on fundamental physical and chemical law. So what I like to say, in like copying nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, we could also say that nothing in the theory of evolution makes sense except in the light of thermodynamics. Okay, and that's what I hope to convince you of. So Darwin recognized, I think it was in the 6th version of his book on the origin of species, he recognized that there were problems in his theory. There were also others that were presenting these problems to him. So he decided to spend some time trying to answer them. So for him, the biggest problem was that there are gaps in the fossil record. He expected to find intermediate fossils of all the variations going from one species to another. And so he wrote, why is it not all nature in confusion instead of well-defined species? And the answer to answer this, he suggested that, well, there's imperfection in the fossil record. So we don't find all of the fossils. It takes us a long time and we're gradually finding more. And if we wait long enough and look hard enough, we're going to find all of the fossils which relate one species to another, all the intermediates, so we can see how the species actually evolved from one to the other. But he wasn't very convinced of that result, that it was just a problem of not having found enough fossils. And so he gave another answer to his problem of gaps in the fossil record, which was that intermediate individuals between the species are not well adapted. And so they would disappear quickly, and the species would have to, or the individuals would have to evolve rapidly into a species which was better adapted for the environment. But even that he was not satisfied with, so that all his life he was struggling with this problem with gaps in the fossil record, and the fact that we see species like they are quantized, they're individual, they're not a complete mix of different individuals with different parts of different species. And it wasn't until Stephen Jay Gould, who presented a book, a very nice book, if you ever have the chance to find it or to buy it. It's called The Structure of Evolutionary Theory by Stephen Jay Gould, who was considered a living legend. So in the US, they have this particular criteria which they apply to algunas or some very important researchers, which they call living legends. And he was considered a living legend, although he never won a Nobel Prize, Stephen Jay Gould. But he came up with this idea of punctuated equilibriums, that really nature, if you look at nature, it was not that it was an imperfection in the fossil record, but in fact that was the way nature was, that there were long periods of stasis. That means periods in which there was no change, punctuated by very rapid change. But in his book, he never gave an explanation that why something like that would occur. There was a little bit of attempts, to explain that, well, a species could, for example, be separated from another, and then one of the species became more adept in the environment, and then it would go back and overtake very quickly the other species. Basically what Darwin was saying, that intermediate individuals were not very well adapted. But it was never really developed, this theory of Stephen Jay Gould, the punctuated equilibrium, although that seems to be what is happening in nature. No, it's a good description of what is happening in nature. Darwin also had another problem, a question, was that why some individuals of a particular species are sterile. For example, worker ants. These ants cannot reproduce themselves. So this, he wrote, this difficulty, although appearing insuperable, is lessened, or as I believe, disappears when it is remembered that selection may be applied to the family as well as to the individual, and may arrive at gain the desired end. So what he was saying here is that maybe we have selection also operating on higher levels. So not only on the individuals, but also on the species level or the family level or the clade or the ecosystem level. But that brings into a lot of problems into the Darwinian theory, which I'll mention in later slides. If you have any questions, please stop me and you can ask them in Spanish, okay? I like questions because I also know that you're listening, that you're still there, because I don't see you right now. So, cualquier pregunta me para, ¿no?
Okay, Doc. Yes,
okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So these were serious problems for the Darwinian theory. In fact, and also I think it was around the 70s, Karl Popper, who was a philosopher, an Austrian philosopher, he in the physical sciences, actually, he was applied basically to physical science. And he was the person who suggested that a scientific theory could only be called that scientific if it could be shown to be falsifiable. So therefore, the theory of God, which you cannot show that it was not true, is not a scientific theory. And so we should spend our time on scientific theories and not on suppositions or propositions which cannot be falsified. And that's a basic tenet now considered in science, that a theory should be able to be falsified. You should be able to show that there is some way that you can prove that your theory is not correct, in principle at least, no? And better in practice, if you can do an experiment to show that the theory is not correct. But his major concern was that there was tautology in the theory of Darwin. So what does the theory of Darwin says? Well, it says that those who are better adapted can reproduce, and so their genes or their physical form will be carried on to the following generation. But what does that mean, to be adapted? Well, it could mean different things for different species. For example, for an ant, it could be being small, but for a bear, it would be being big. So there's a whole plethora of different characteristics which you could attribute to being useful for adaptation. So then the theory becomes something like survival of those that survive. What does it mean? Being better adapted means being able to survive. So really the theory of Darwin is saying nothing more than survival of the survivors. This was a tautology which Popper suggested was inherent in the theory of Darwinian theory. And later he recanted on that, so he criticized himself and said that, well, there's not exactly tautology, but he still called Darwinism a theory, Darwinian theory, a metaphysical research program. He didn't think it was really based on physical principles, no? And obviously it's not based on physical principles, so it is really a metaphysical program. But the tautology still remains, even though Popper recanted, there is still some tautology. Because unless you define adaptation in terms of actual physics and chemistry and the fundamental laws of nature, you're not going to get away from that tautology. Those that are better adapted are those that are going to survive, because there's a great difference in the environment for different species. So he realized that if you define the environment well enough, then some of the tautology of the Darwinian theory goes away. So if you say that, for example, you put bacteria in a plate with a certain type of sugar, then only those bacteria which can digest that sugar are going to survive, and you can show that there is some kind of selection based on adaptation to the food source or the supply of free energy in the system. But in general, the system is so complex and it's so much in hierarchical status and structure and connected, interconnected, that it's almost impossible to say what are the characteristics that an organism needs to survive. And so you end up saying that those better adapted are those which survive, but then you're just saying that you're saying survival of the survivors and nothing else. So you still have this tautology. Okay, there's also other problems with Darwinian theory. For example, life appears to be different from abiotic objects by having an inherent will to survive, which we sometimes call the vitality of life. But how do you define this vitality in terms of physics and chemistry? Put it on a more fundamental basis, on physical laws. So that hasn't been addressed in Darwinian theory still, or not sufficiently. And you can also, like Darwin, ask at what level is natural selection operating? Well, Darwin at first assumed that it was at the individual level, but then he realized that there are organisms in which many of the individuals are sterile. That means they cannot reproduce. And so his theory would fail. Unless he said, well, we can have natural selection operating on the species level or a higher level, like the family, clade, ecosystem. But as you go up in these levels of the ecosystem, then you start to get problems with Darwinian theory, because, for example, when you get to an ecosystem, you don't really have two ecosystems competing one against the other, and then selecting the ecosystem which is better adapted. Certainly not at the biosphere. We don't have two biospheres which are fighting against each other and being selected that which is better adapted. So you have this problem which Rod Swenson first pointed out, that at the level of the biosphere, you have an evolution of a system of a population of one. And so that just doesn't make sense. There was also interesting work of Richard Dawkins, a book which he called The Selfish Gene, in which he said it was not the individual which was being selected, it was being selected the gene. So the individual was just a survival machine for the gene. And so the gene or the genome is what was being selected. But even that didn't make much sense. And really now, if you think about it, at all of these levels, there are problems if you stick with the Darwinian theory. But if you go to thermodynamics, then you can see that you can have different coupled irreversible processes. And the selection is at the global level of increasing the photon dissipation, the biosphere, in its interaction with the sun. Okay, so you can read Richard Dawkins' book. It's interesting, but don't put too much attention to it because all of these levels have a problem of selection. So there was also the problem of inefficient biological processes not being eliminated by natural selection. For example, transpiration of the plants. You know, why do plants transpire? They, in fact, evaporate large quantities of water. A single tree, a big tree, can evaporate or transpire about 1,000 liters of water per day. So that's a big tinaco of water per day. And why would plants be wasting all this free energy on transpiring when it could be used for their metabolism, for instance? And so some of the biologists came up with the idea, well, we need water flow through the plants to bring the nutrients up to different parts of the plants. So transpiration is just like a pump, which is feeding the water flow from the root system and the nutrients up into the plant. But it turns out if you put plants in greenhouses where you have 100% humidity, relative humidity, so that means you don't get any transpiration because there's no chemical potential for evaporating. Turns out the plants survive perfectly well. They don't need transpiration in this sense to survive. So that's not a relevant answer to the question. There's also a problem that many organisms exude microsporine pigments into their environment. There are a lot of organisms, microscopic organisms, which live in the soil or in the water on the ocean surface and the surface of lakes, which have the tendency to emit pigments into their environment. And these pigments, of course, are separated from the organism, so they eventually disperse. So why would the organism be spending effort and free energy to make these pigments if they weren't even useful to them? So there have been some intents now to try to describe, well, maybe these pigments are useful to them, but on a level of a population level again, no? So exuding pigments into the environment can protect them, for example, from the ultraviolet radiation. But if you put these organisms in an ultraviolet environment, you see that they can survive, or at least depending on the wavelength range, of course, but there's no problem. They don't need to protect themselves from the ultraviolet light. Another problem is called the paradox of the first tier, which was Gould who also brought that up. And just quoting Gould, he said, most primitive forms, which are the prokaryote bacteria, have never surrendered their vast kingdom on Earth. They are by far the most abundant and most persistent of all life to have arisen on Earth. They still dominate life on Earth, forming two of the three major boughs of present-day life. Phyletic tree, the archaea, the bacteria, and the yeast. So he's saying that there are some organisms which have remained primitive, which have not evolved. And they have remained basically the same for thousands of millions of years. And these are the prokaryote bacteria. So that is a little bit against the idea of Darwinism, the theory of Darwinism, in that all organisms are adapting and increasing their adaptability or their survivability with respect to the environment and evolving into new forms which are better adapted. No? So there appears to be very little evolution in this prokaryote bacteria, but still they are around. So this species is primitive and it's not evolving. So what is happening there? Doesn't seem to fit with the Darwinian theory. Another problem is that there is no function defined for life. For example, there's no cause, no purpose. So what was it? Was it a spurious accident? We know from the thermodynamic point of view that all irreversible processes indeed have a function, and that is the dissipation of a generalized thermodynamic potential. So here we have an answer that indeed there is a function for life, although the biologist will negate that and say that there is no function. It just so happened that life appeared, probably was an accident, and there's nothing that life is fighting for or against in nature. It's just trying to survive itself.
Tengo una pregunta.
Sí,
¿Lo
claro.
que no está vivo no disipa nada? Es decir,
No.
¿no?
También disipan los, digamos, los cristalinos inorgánicas, disipan también, pero vamos a encontrar, y tenemos algo publicado en este que luego les puedo mandar, mostrando que las moléculas orgánicas por mucho disipan mucho mejor que la materia no biótica. Es decir, que se absorben fotones de más larga rango de longitud de onda, desde el muy ultravioleta a 200 nanómetros, hacia 700 nanómetros donde hay la borde rojo, ¿no? Se absorben en todo ese rango y las moléculas, digamos, inorgánicas o cristalinos inorgánicas no tienen esta capacidad y tampoco tienen estos intersections cónicas para que disipan rápidamente. Si tienes una intersección cónica en una molécula orgánica, por ejemplo, puedes absorber un fotón y luego en pico segundo, 10 a la menos 12 segundos, estás listo para absorber otro fotón. Pero ese no es el caso en la materia inorgánica. Entonces sí hay diferencias. Y parece que la materia orgánica es mejor adaptada a la disipación que la materia inorgánica. Por ejemplo, si comparamos la producción de entropía, que realmente es nada más que la disipación de fotones, entre la Tierra y sus vecinos, sus planetas vecinos, que son Marte y Venus, vemos que la Tierra disipa mucho más por área cuadrada y por su distancia del Sol que los otros dos planetas vecinos, que supuestamente no tienen la vida. Creemos nosotros que estos dos planetas vecinos sí tienen la vida, tienen los primeros pasos de la vida, que son las moléculas orgánicas para absorber y disipar, sí lo tienen, pero no tienen un biosfera, digamos, como la Tierra muy desarrollado, evolucionado, basado en la materia orgánica. Okay?
Okay. Sí, gracias.
Okay, so another problem then with Darwinian theory is natural selection. So, but what is selecting what? Darwin stated that the environment is selecting the individual. But we know also that individuals can change their environment to their own advantage. For example, a beaver, he builds a beaver dam so that he has a pond for swimming in and for changing the environment so that he is able to survive. No, he can change quite a bit the environment. So what is selecting what? Is the environment selecting the individual, or is the individual selecting the environment? That's a problem in Darwinian theory, no? Okay, that it was basically thought that the environment was selecting the individual. But now if we realize that the individual can select the environment, for example, another example is a bug which lives under a leaf. No, its entire life under a leaf. So it selected its environment. So it's not the environment which is selecting the bug, but the bug is selecting the environment. So these are rather existential problems, but from the point of view of thermodynamics, we can say that, well, it's a coupled irreversible process. And they're both being selected thermodynamically such that the system together is a better dissipator of photons coming from the sun. Okay, that would be the short answer. Okay, I'd like to also bring your attention to the theory of Gaia. Maybe some of you have heard about it. It's a very interesting theory. James Lovelock, who's the guy here on the left, he came up with this idea and was not able to publish his works. He tried in various journals, but they rejected it. Now, whenever he goes to give a talk, he gets a standing ovation. I think he just died recently. He died like last year, but when he was alive and gave talks, everybody would stand up in the room, mostly the biologists, and give him a standing ovation. So he was really a physicist and an engineer. And another famous person was Lynn Margulis, who also worked a lot on this theory of Gaia with James Lovelock. Lynn Margulis was the first wife of Carl Sagan, the famous physicist and publicist of science. Very, very beautiful books and videos if you ever have chance to watch Carl Sagan's videos. They're very interesting. He's a very good speaker and very good educator. So anyway, James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis came up with the idea that living organisms interact very strongly and alter their environment in such a way as to stabilize the conditions for their own existence. So this was a reason given for an animal or organism changing its environment, to stabilize again its own existence, to increase its survivability. So that's again in the line of the Darwinian theory. So some examples that they found were, for example, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, 21%. Today it's 21%. In the past it was less. But there's no reason, well, there is a reason in terms of biology, but it could have gone higher. And what happens when it goes a little bit over, like it gets to 23%, then we can have spontaneous combustion of trees in dry areas. So they will just spontaneously combust and destroy the environment. So it seems like the life on Earth is doing something to keep the amount of oxygen at exactly 21% and not above that. And how is this controlled by the organisms on Earth's surface? And the answer that they found was that bacterial erosion of minerals would lead to oxidation, so take out some of the oxygen. So because of the bacteria which are living in the earth and on the rocks, and so they're eroding these rocks, they're allowing the metals to come out into the atmosphere and cause oxidation, which is taking away oxygen out of the environment and keeping the level at 21%. They also found, for example, that the levels of salt in the oceans have been relatively constant for a long period of time. And how does life keep the salt in the oceans constant? Because, you know, as rainwater, when it goes on land and it precipitates into the surface, then it takes with it salts from the material from on land and brings them to the ocean. So the amount of salt is incrementing, or the quantity of salt to the oceans is being incremented, while there is this water cycle and there's these rivers which taking the salt into the oceans. So what they found is that bacteria can make mats or tracks over tidal pools. So if you have, for example, an area with a coral reef near to the shore, then that would form a tidal pool. And so if you had salt water there, then you would get some evaporation, and so the salt would increase. And you would get also waves coming over and into the tidal pool and then depositing more salt. Okay, so they found that these bacterial mats are very good at keeping the salt fixed in the tidal pools so that they don't go back into the ocean, because it prevents the dissolution of the salt into the water. And that's why, for example, we know that the mining, when we mine salt for our table, for our restaurants and for eating, it comes from these areas which were once tidal pools in which the amount of salt